Okay, we're going to get started and allow people to trickle in. My introduction is not the important part. It's the conversation with Dr. Ashrawi. This is an honor to be able to host Dr. Hanan Ashrawi today. In my view, one of the great leaders alive today, whom we can learn much from, not just regarding Israel-Palestine, the Middle East, but also ethical leadership more generally. She served as a member of the leadership committee of the PLO and as an official spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process. Beginning in Madrid, she made history as the first woman to hold a seat in the highest executive body in Palestine and was elected a member of the executive committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 2009 and most recently in 2018. She did resign in 2020. We're joining her today from Ramallah. I'm in New York. I'll intro Telos in the call a little bit in just one moment, but I did want to make a personal note about Dr. Ashrawi so you know where I am coming from in this conversation. I remember first hearing Dr. Ashrawi when I was in high school in San Diego, Palestinian American, and I heard her brilliance, her eloquence, and her love for justice, and it moved me. I was so taken with this remarkable human being, and I idolized her for many years. And about a decade later, after I went to law school, I found myself interning for her during the 2000 peace negotiations, the failed so-called Camp David peace negotiations, which jump-started my involvement in sort of this Israel-Palestine at a professional level. I'm just personally thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you, Dr. Ashrawi, and to invite many others. I'm distraught, I think, as we all are in this current moment. We were going to be talking about the Palestinian elections when we first scheduled this a couple months ago, the first elections in 16 years, which now again have been quote unquote postponed, but something bigger is happening right now. And there may be a connection that we'll explore, but we see the reality on the ground, I think at its most dangerous point in recent memory. There's a lack of leadership on all sides, not just among Israelis and Palestinians, but in the international community right now. I'd love to just begin to get your sense from Ramallah, what's happening, what's familiar this time, what's different, what should we be looking out for? Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Ashrawi.
Thank you very much, Greg. It's great to be with you. And thank you for your introduction. And I like the personal bit. It always makes it more intimate and more human. Thank you very much. Actually, you could say it's more of the same, or in terms it's a culmination of a process that has been ongoing and escalating for a long time, reaching its head, coming to a head. Or you can say that this is a qualitative shift in terms of the degree and intensity of the violence, but we know that Israel has been using violence for a long time. We can talk about how it is part of a process and contextualize what's happening since Israel as an occupying power, not just since 1967, but since its establishment, since its creation in 1947-48, has acted outside the law and with full impunity, and has targeted the Palestinian people systematically and relentlessly in order to create greater Israel, in order to take over all of Palestine. And after 1967, it became very apparent that this occupation is not temporary, as people think, but it has become permanent and a tool for expansion, a tool for superimposing greater Israel on all of Palestine, a tool for subjugating a whole nation, depriving us of all our rights, human rights, political rights, legal rights, demolishing homes, stealing land, building settlements, and actually creating a situation where you have a whole captive population that is entirely, in many cases, powerless. Israel controls airspace, territorial waters, borders, crossing points. and has manipulated and has controlled every aspect of Palestinian life. So more recently with the Trump administration's collusion, but this comes also as a result of the strategic alliance with Israel that the US always claimed, every US administration. And with the shift to the extreme racist, violent right in Israel, there was a deliberate escalation, and an escalation that sought to, first of all, carry out ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, evacuate the city, change the character of the city, and its culture, its history, the integrity of Jerusalem, and trying to evict and kick out Palestinians from their homes, especially in Sheikh Jarrah, as you know, in Silwan now, in other areas, and to isolate Jerusalem and surround it with free rings, settlements, checkpoints, and the walls. This became quite apparent now that there are no restraints or constraints on Israeli behavior, that its actions were all done with full impunity, with collusion on the one hand, or with a feeble sort of verbal rejection or denunciation, but Israel did it anyway. And then it targeted the holiest site to Muslims during the month of Ramadan. And it entered and it shot stun grenades and tear gas even inside the mosque at the worshippers. It pursued worshippers. It tried to prevent Palestinians from celebrating the month in outdoor spaces and so on. At the same time attacking Sheikh Jarrah and trying to evict Palestinians. So this was, to many Palestinians, this was really a red line, that now you are really trying to take over and ethnically cleanse Jerusalem, but also create facts the way it has done in the holy site, in the Haram Sharif compound and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that inflamed people. And there were, and Israel met them with enormous violence, particularly when Netanyahu supported the Kahanist group, Lahava, I think, and got them into the Knesset and encouraged them to start these marches against the Palestinians, shouting death to the Arabs, kill the Arabs, and so on, with all sorts of horrific racist statements, to the point where, again, all these matters came to a head. That's why I'm saying it's part of a pattern, but it's a serious escalation. No. And then Hamas issued its warnings, several warnings, and then finally it came out with a deadline. Hands off Al-Aqsa, stop all of these measures in Jerusalem, hands off the Palestinians, hundreds are wounded and imprisoned and so on, and or else we will have to take steps because we have to protect Al-Aqsa. This inflamed again Arab and Muslim public opinion. Probably all people of good conscience, you know, who didn't want to see this type of violence and brutality. And then when Israel escalated more, Hamas started shooting these projectiles into Israel, which served Netanyahu to start escalating and shelling and bombing Gaza. It's like putting people in a cage, you know, and then shooting at them while they have nowhere to go. They don't have the Iron Dome, they don't have even warning sirens, they don't have shelters, they have nowhere to run to. And of course they don't have B-16, B-17 bombers or gunships and so on. So you have a large number of people killed. By now it's 56% Palestinians killed, many of them, 14 of them children, 3 of them women. A family was killed as well. You have whole buildings, residential apartments and so on, totally destroyed and collapsed. 13 floors of residential building was killed. So they robbed people of their shelter, of their belongings, of their sense of history of their place. And they traumatized because they've been shelling and bombing nonstop, day and night. And that created, as we said, a whole new situation in which people felt that now somebody is sending a message to Israel that we're not going to sit back and do nothing. We're not going to sit back and watch you terrorize the Palestinians repeatedly. And as you know, they did this to Gaza before. And there will be a price to be paid since nobody else is doing it. And that is the first difference.
Well, I very much appreciate you taking a step back, because I think so many of us, when we heard about this in the States and other parts of the world, the first thing that people see are the rockets, and the rockets didn't happen in a vacuum. And in fact, you know, this struggle for Sheikh Jarrah has been happening, intensifying for weeks, but has been going on for years. And I'd recommend that folks watch the film My Neighborhood from Just Vision to get a sense of what was happening in this small neighborhood. And I think we may return to that. But I think the more pressing question for us now is, I think you can, you know, you did a good job of describing just sort of this back and forth and what led to this massive escalation. But now, you know, things feel quite different. How does this end? I have colleagues, we have an office in Jaffa, and last night, you know, you see scenes throughout, you know, Israel of this mob violence between Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And this is something we really haven't seen for many years. And given the absence of leadership, this feels potentially more volatile. So we're in this moment. We know we can't go back to normal because normal never was normal. But how does this particular moment end when everybody seems to be throwing more fuel on the fire?
Yeah, the thing is, the Palestinians in Israel have been living under a racist, discriminatory regime all their lives. They're the original people, they're the indigenous people of the land. Israel was created, came to them, as they said, we didn't go to Israel. Israel was created on our land. They robbed them of all their land. They legislated against their rights. They are second, third class citizens anyway, without the rights of citizenship. And then Israel legislated this basic law, which is called the nation state law, in which they declared that only Jews have the right to self-determination in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, which includes, of course, all of Palestine. And this really led to what we call legalized discrimination, in the sense that there is exclusivity and exclusion. There is an attempt at depriving them of any rights, whether property rights or other rights in Israel. And it increased, it stepped up, of course, the practice of discrimination, economic, educational, social, in every possible way, territorial. They left them with only 3% of the land. They used to own over 90% of the land, now they have only 3%. So matters again have been building up. But this time, with the targeting of Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem, with this built up and pent up sense of frustration and anger, and with a sense of identification, because it's the Palestinian identity as a whole, it's the Palestinian history and culture that is being targeted. Because they're telling us, you know, this has always been, you know, Israel and so on. And we know that we've been living there for centuries, that this is where we are. And we're not the invisible or the non-existent Palestinians, or the myth that this was a land without a people, for a people without a land. So they started feeling that collectively they are being targeted. Their history, their identity, their culture, and they are being faced with an ethno-religious, ethno-sectarian identity, hyper nationalism from Israel that is exclusive, that excludes everybody else. And so there was a sense of community. No, we are going to defend our rights. We are going to defend each other because we are one nation and one people, regardless of the passport or the citizenship that we carry. We are Palestinian. And so you have in Lid, in Ramle, in Haifa, in Akka, people came out, Palestinians came out protesting what Israel is doing in Jerusalem and also in the West Bank, because they've always stood in solidarity with us. Again, in the West Bank, every night, there are demonstrations and protests, and the army, the Israeli occupation army, meets them faces them with tremendous violence. They shot and killed two people, one of them a 16-year-old teenager, the second one within this week. They imprisoned scores of people. They've injured about 340 people. So it's not just in Jerusalem and the mosque, which are an ongoing situation of assault and siege, but also in the rest of the cities and towns and villages of the West Bank and within Israel itself, the Palestinians in Israel, whom they like to call as the Arabs of Israel or the Israeli Arabs, but because they don't want to even recognize the fact that these are Palestinians whose land they stole, as if the Arabs came to Israel. And they don't want to recognize the Palestinian identity. So that's why now you see this commonality of struggle, this joint identification, the same way you see in Washington, in New York, in Manhattan, in Chicago, you see these demonstrations by Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, solidarity groups, demonstrating in defense of Palestinian rights and denouncing what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. We see it also in Europe. So there is a rising awareness that this cannot be done in the dark anymore. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as Ilan Pape calls it, of 1947-48, was done largely in the dark and was exposed only when the intelligence documents were finally being reviewed by the new historians. The Palestinian version never came out. But now you cannot carry out a regime of ethnic cleansing in the dark. And with social media and with people being aware of what's happening, there is a greater sense of solidarity and a greater sense of identification and a greater sense of moral responsibility and humanity that are emerging in order to help and support the Palestinians. So that is something new.
Yeah.
And it seems, when they sent the border guards, which they usually, and the army that they usually sent to the occupied territories, to the West Bank, they sent them to Lid. The joke was that now Israel is reoccupying Lid, which is within Israel, because Israel cleansed Lid of most of its citizens. As you know, it's the most horrific story of how they rounded up people and shot them, and then the rest, they made them walk all the way. They walked for days till they came, many of them came to Ramallah, and they're living in this refugee camp next to Ramallah. So there are so many stories intertwined here.
Yeah, and I do think, I want to bring it back to about what's happening today, but I'm very grateful for you bringing this larger context in. I think, as you know, in the States here, I mean, just when this finally made the New York Times front page, it was just like, they're angry Palestinians and they're Hamas rockets. And there was no context there, not to excuse the rockets by any stretch of the imagination. But, this Saturday, May 15th, is Nakba Day. And so for anyone listening who really wants to understand how Palestinians experience not just this current reality, but the past decades, the Nakba, or catastrophe, which was the period surrounding Israel's independence, it was the time when more than 3/4 of the indigenous Palestinian Muslim Christian population were expelled or fled from their homes and never allowed to return. We often hear people say, well, why can't Palestinians just move on? Why don't they just get over it? But the reality today is most Palestinians don't live in Palestine. In fact, most still are stuck against most of the time against their own will and volition in refugee camps around the Middle East. And what we saw in Sheikh Jarrah with those expulsions is interpreted as, no, the Nakba didn't happen, in 1947 to 49. It's ongoing. It's continuing today with the continued dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, with the expansion of settlements and the replacement of Palestinian communities with settlers. And so for Palestinians, the core of the conflict is not simply, wanting self-determination or a statehood. It's this human rights violation of being completely divorced and disenfranchised of identity, of voice, of land, of agency. And I think, wherever your politics stand, if you don't understand that, you're missing a key part of the story that's happening right now. But we're getting some
No,
questions.
I'm glad you mentioned the Nakba as an ongoing process, because where we are now is the result of this ongoing Nakba, and it exposes the bad faith with which Israel claimed that it wants to negotiate peace, and yet it continued with the same modus operandi, the same methods of the earlier Nakba, of ethnic cleansing, of targeting, of home demolitions, and of land theft and the building of settlements. So this is an ongoing process by means of which Israel attempts to displace the Palestinians and replace them with another people, with another history, with another culture, and by appropriating everything Palestinian, from the land to the cuisine, by the way.
Well, I'd love to hear more about that, but we're getting some amazing questions in here. One is an obvious one that many people are asking is, when is the, is this the beginning of the third intifada, or do we say that? And I guess a follow-up to that question is, what good comes out of this if it is? Like, we know there's a particular power dynamic on the ground. I'm not trying to tell people what to do, how to feel, but is this the beginning of a third intifada? And where does this lead us? Again, how does this end for those of us who really care about the welfare of everyone and the future of everyone there? Because both Palestinians and Israelis have the right to security, dignity, and freedom. This flare-up could really take us into a completely different chapter of this central conflict.
Yeah, it is incremental, as you know. But let me just go back to the term intifada. Now, people generally in the US use the term intifada, or in the West, as though it's violent. And those of us who've lived through the first intifada and the smaller intifadas before that, it's not necessarily violent. An intifada is an expression of will. It's the spirit of resistance. It's refusing to be defeated. It's struggling against injustice and against the oppression and the suppression of human rights and so on that you are facing. So to us, we are in a constant state of intifada, and it takes on many shapes. Unlike Jared Kushner and others who told us that we have to accept defeat, the Palestinian people, despite everything they've been through, have never internalized or accepted the mentality of defeat. We know we are under occupation. We know that half our population is out in exile, displaced and expelled. But we still maintain this spirit of resistance, of commitment to our cause, and of hope that ultimately we will prevail. We are not going to disappear. We are not going to commit, collective amnesia. We are not going to lie down and die and accept Israel's version of the erasure of a whole nation. No, we are here, we are on the land, and we are resilient, and we will stay despite the pain and the tragedy, the collective tragedy. So yes, this is another expression of resistance. The big intifada was totally nonviolent, as you know. We were beaten up, we were shot at, we were tear gassed, we were detained, imprisoned. I went through all these things myself. And to us, it was like, this is life under occupation. You either become a passive victim, or you stand up for what is right, for justice and freedom and human dignity. And if you stop having an intifada, it means that you have acquiesced, you have succumbed to the injustice and the horror of this sense of captivity and manipulation of human rights. So that's another. No, but this is, we could say it's incremental in the sense that it is taking you to another dimension, a dimension in which Israel, no matter what it does, cannot defeat a whole people, including a captive people. This is the fourth time in which it launches a war against people under siege. And in previous attacks, it killed thousands, as you know, and now it is destroying everything. And yet they haven't given up. But the Palestinians within, the reaction of the international community, not everybody, many people in power and many people who are, spin doctors and who try to justify Israel no matter what it does, still suffer from willful blindness or deliberate ignorance, if you will. But the truth is coming out. And even within American official circles and the American administration, there are those who are beginning to see that there can be no peace, no security for anybody, no stability anywhere in the region, so long as Israel is treated is given preferential treatment and is treated as being a state above the law, and the Palestinians are deprived of the protection of the law, that this will continue to destabilize this. And this kind of solidarity within Palestine and this kind of popular uprising, because it is popular, it is not run by anybody. It's the people who spontaneously came out and said, that's enough. We will not put up with this anymore. We're not going to be liberated now, but maybe it will open people's eyes. If you ignore the Palestinian question, it's not going to disappear or go away. It has a way of imposing itself on your agenda. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I mean that you can try to ignore Jerusalem, but Jerusalem won't ignore you. Is the old saying, sadly. But we do have on this note, we have a couple interesting questions in the chat coming through. One, this is a question that get a lot, is, well, when Israelis and Palestinians talk about sort of the current situation, why is it that people only talk about the losses on their side? And you just mentioned that there's going to be no security, stability for the region as long as this situation of one people controlling another is allowed to persist. And we also, I think, would note that there's probably no good future for Israelis or Palestinians without a good future for everyone, ultimately.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
How do you respond to that question?
Look, the thing is, the difference between us is that we never really negated or denied the humanity of the other. We even recognized Israel and Israel's right to exist, which they didn't even recognize us. They don't recognize us as a people or our right to self-determination and freedom. And we, as the victims, even in the Madrid speech, I'm sure you know that speech, I wrote it with a sense of commitment that we reach out to our oppressor and say we will make peace. We have scaled the walls of fear, and we said we will acknowledge our common humanity and so on. We tried to reach to the Israelis so that they will understand that we are not just their slaves, we are not enslaved by the situation, but that there can be a way in which we can live side by side as equals. And this hasn't happened, unfortunately. Not only that, but there's a whole system of power, a whole structure of control, of demonizing the Palestinians, of blaming the victim, of dehumanizing us, and therefore justifying whatever they do to us. It's horrific. I don't see how anybody else could have lived under such a situation of total oppression, of total vulnerability, without losing their humanity. And yet, it's not up to the victim always to continue to try to reassure the oppressor. It's not up to the people under occupation to reassure the occupiers that no, we will defend you, or we will not allow anything to hurt you, or whatever. When you are deliberately, we use this expression even way before Black Lives Matter, when we said, get off our necks. We are unable to breathe. We are unable to live. And they redefined, they devalued our lives and our rights and the value of our time and energy and everything. So it doesn't mean you dehumanize your oppressor, but as we wrote in that speech, we know you. We have seen you at your worst and at your best, because the oppressor only knows the victim only insofar as they can control you. But we saw the underbelly of the occupation. And we know what's good within Israel, the people who come and defend us and who share with us the struggle and who defend our rights and stand in solidarity and get treated like Palestinians and pay the price. And we know the whole army and the whole military machine that kills and destroys and oppresses. So we have seen everything. And that's why we're saying, never put the onus on the victim, on the people who are totally subjugated, not in spirit, but at least physically. People who are so vulnerable that they are supposed to overcome their own sense of grief and fear and so on, and try to reassure or comfort the oppressor. What we have to do is to challenge the rest of the world, challenge everybody, recognize the humanity of the Palestinians, recognize our rights as equals. For the first time, by the way, somebody, I think in the State Department, said that Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve, freedom and so on, which is something we've never heard before from any American administration, because all they talk about is the security of Israel. Now, tell me, can there be any security for an oppressor when you are doing all these things to a whole nation? No, there can be no normalization of an abnormal situation like the occupation. So you cannot claim self-defense from your victim when you are doing everything you can to them and getting away with it. Because Israel is behaving like a rogue state. Israel claims a sense of entitlement and preferential treatment and claims that the law doesn't apply to it. And therefore, the Palestinians are deprived of any legal protection or human protection. So that's why we need the truth to come out. Israel needs to understand that you cannot normalize the occupation. And you cannot expect the Palestinians to surrender. They will not.
And, I hear you very clearly. I have, as you know, a large extended family in Beit Sahur, just outside of Bethlehem. And
Wow.
generations, 4 generations have been living in this situation where they don't control anything in their lives. And where, the frame is always Israeli security. And of course, Israel's a state and is going to want to protect the security of its citizens. But what about their security? What about their freedom? What about their dignity? What about their basic rights? And for everyone there. And so I hear you that very clearly that it's not about sort of blaming the victim or casting the victim in a particular way. Where I think there is some tension in how, this is communicated with the outside world is that, it feels for many people who don't see this asymmetry in power as sort of this he said, she said thing. And if we really are working towards a future in which everyone can flourish, how do we cast vision for that? But I hear you that it's not your responsibility when you're trying to get a boot off your neck. And, I'm sure there's a lot of debate about that, but I'm seeing some questions come in, which
but just let me interject here, but there are many Jewish American organizations, there are many Israeli organizations who are our allies, who dare to stand up and speak out, who present the real narrative, the real version of what's happening. These are the people that the world will listen to, because the Palestinians have been rendered invisible or silenced. People, of course you're a Palestinian, going to say these things. But no, when we tell the truth, we also need collaboration from Israelis and Jewish organizations, as well as people of good conscience, as I say, all over the world. And they're doing this now. There are people who are bearing witness. There are people who are advocating. There are people who are refusing to deal with the lie. And there are people who are exposing what's happening and who are standing with us in solidarity and in challenging the power system that has created a systemic form of victimization for the Palestinians. But I want to point out also that we do not relish the role of victim. We don't like to be victims. We don't like to constantly have to talk about our pain and suffering and so on, but we live it. So what we want is to have the ability to lead a normal life. That's all. We don't want to be heroes. We don't want to be heroic. We don't want to be martyrs. We just want to be ordinary. I want to live with my daughters. I want to have my grandchildren with me, which I can't have because they confiscated their IDs. So it's really difficult to have who was it, Clinton, who said the quiet miracle of an ordinary life? I mean, we are jealous when we see people who take their identity for granted, their house for granted, their rights for granted, because we can't take anything for granted. Yeah. And so what we need to do is to challenge this system of oppression, this whole system of rendering the Palestinians as invisible. This whole system where one people have all the rights and other people have none. And that's what needs to be challenged by everybody, not just the Palestinians.
And I want to get to I'm very, by the way, I think there's some coughing on your background. I don't know what's going on, but we have, or it's,
Coughing?
yeah, is that, or we're getting some noise
No.
somewhere. Maybe it's a participant. If participants could make sure you're on mute. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but I want to get, that's exactly where I want to get to in just a moment. We're having lots of great questions come in, but the point is, what can we do? We have a diverse group of people on this call, an incredibly diverse group. As you know, Dr. Ashrawi, Telos works with everyone from progressives to conservatives, but about 2-3/4 of our work is with either politically or theologically conservative Christians. It is the Holy Land, after all. So I want us to be able to walk away from this call understanding, regardless of what our background is, what can we do to help advance a shift in the conversation to one that focuses on fundamental rights for everyone, on human rights rather than just political interest in the long term, but how we can support folks in the short term. Before we get there, I do want to draw in some questions just about sort of what's happening on the Palestinian side. So we see on the Israeli side, for example, and this is what terrifies me, Netanyahu, who's been in office for 12 years, is potentially facing jail time. He potentially is finally nearing in the next couple weeks the end of his tenure. And now there's this big security conflagration, which may necessitate his leadership, which may be something that can allow him to move on. We see Biden administration has made so explicitly clear that they think this is a losing fight. They don't want to push this issue at all. They haven't even appointed a consul general on the ground, an ambassador to Israel, the appropriate State Department staff as this crisis looms. To be fair, it takes a while to get these appointments done, but it's not a priority for them. And that's what they've communicated. They see the split within the Democratic Party on this issue, and they see on the Republican side that there's nobody who wants to challenge sort of an ever increasingly conservative or hardline, quote unquote, pro-Israel agenda. But on the Palestinian side, I'm wondering, we were about to see first elections in 16 years. And I have an anonymous question in the chat from someone whom I don't want to presume is Palestinian, but may well be, who says, will we have to wait for Abu Mazen to die the same way we had to wait for Abu Ammar to die, who's Yasser Arafat, to have newly elected leadership? And I'm wondering how this plays into the dynamic. Does Hamas feel particularly emboldened in this moment, for example, now that, Abbas, again, who was increasingly unpopular, didn't win any favors from anyone on the ground for postponing the elections, which people really wanted.
Yes.
What's happening here on the Palestinian side, and what can Palestinians and what should they do, and including those of us in the diaspora, to help reinvigorate a Palestinian national movement that has the ability to ask on the international stage, to provide solidarity, to build unlikely relationships across lines of difference, all the elements of a movement that really lead to transformation on the ground?
Yeah, Greg, you've asked about 15 questions in the same breath. Okay, I'll get back to, I'll start with the elections because I know you want to know that issue, and that's something that bothers many Palestinians everywhere. Yes, there was a tremendous sense of excitement and enthusiasm that we are going to have elections. Finally, we are going to be able to hold our leadership accountable. We are going to be able to elect new people. We're going to make room for the young, for women, which is one reason I resigned, among others. And that we will reinvigorate and re-legitimize our political system that has slowly become more dysfunctional, and with the erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms and so on. And then there was this political calculation, because within Fatah, the president's party, there were splits, I would say, not splinters. They split into three. That meant that the mainstream of Mahmoud Abbas will not get a clear majority. I don't think anybody would have gotten a majority, which means necessitates the fact that people would have to form alliances and coalitions. And it meant that all the tools of power will no longer be under the control of one party, one person. And that did not go down well with many people. not just with Mahmoud Abbas or Fatah or anybody, but also with people like in the US who hinted that they don't want to see Hamas, taking over, or they don't want to see elections that would not produce the right people. Remember in 2006, when Hamas got the majority seats, although it didn't get the majority votes, we were punished. The Palestinian people were placed under sanctions for electing the wrong people. So democracy is fine, provided you elect the people we like. There were also hints by some Arab countries that you cannot do that, postpone the elections. There were several. Israel definitely did want to see elections where Hamas can be legitimized and part of a larger democratic inclusive system, because that's what we all wanted, an inclusive system. And so even Israel was working against elections. And so it chose not to allow the Palestinians to run in Jerusalem, because it wanted to maintain its control over Jerusalem and to claim that it has sovereign rights in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is not Palestinian, therefore Palestinians cannot vote in Jerusalem. And of course, that was a perfect excuse, not just an excuse, but people really don't want to give up Jerusalem in any way, shape, or form. It is the heart of Palestine. And so they said, we will not have elections so long as Israel is not enabling us to have elections in Jerusalem. And we need the international community to ensure that we will be able to have elections in Jerusalem. And of course, the Europeans who were pushing for the decree for elections, and they said, we need that decree in order to pressure Israel to allow you to vote in Jerusalem. We said, why don't you start putting pressure on Israel and telling Israel that we need to have elections in Jerusalem? They said, no, we can't do that unless you have the decree. So the president issued the decree, and the Central Elections Commission started working, and 93, 94% of eligible voters registered. I think we have the highest number of people registering to vote. 94%, almost 94. We had 36 electoral lists, not just one or two or three, many of them young, excited, promising people, many young women and men educated and so on, many independents. And there was the beginning of a sense of relief that we are going to enter a new era now. So with Israel refusing, with the political calculations, with the external intervention, all matters came together and created a very negative picture for elections. And the president then postponed elections indefinitely. So people were, in a sense, suffering from a collective sense of letdown, disappointment, anger. I mean, it ranged from people saying we will delegitimize, we will have civil disobedience, to people who said it's useless. They're not going to listen, and the people in charge will do whatever they want, and we can't stop them. So this, along with the escalation in Israeli oppression and violence and injustice and so on, all came to a head, and the people just went out into the streets. They went out and they protested, and they lost their sense of fear, which is very important, because they were faced. And there was I don't know if you've seen them, but young Palestinians who are beaten up and dragged and so on, and then handcuffed and dropped. They made a point of looking at the camera and smiling. And people said, why are you smiling? You create a wrong impression that this is easy or you're happier. No, this is not easy at all. People know that they are going to be they're beaten up, they're in pain, they're going to be mistreated and ill-treated and thrown into jail for no fault of their own. But yet they sent the smile to everybody, saying, we are doing something meaningful. We are defying. We are not succumbing. We are not surrendering. So this all came together. Now, I'm sure had this not happened, probably people will be demonstrating against the Palestinian leadership. because they're very unhappy. There's another factor to this, Greg. You asked long questions, but let me answer this. The other factor is that we wanted to pull together all components of Palestinian life and reality. We are Palestinians who suffer different kinds of injustices, those in the West Bank under occupation, those in Israel who are under siege and being treated differently in Jerusalem, those in Israel who are under tremendous discrimination, and those in Gaza who are in a state of siege and captive and unable to move and living in a place that is not habitable anymore. And then you have the Palestinians in exile and in refugee camps. We consider you an exile. We consider, maybe you want to be an expat, but we consider Palestinians who are unable to come back as exiles because most of them were kicked out. And then those who were forcibly kicked out and evacuated and are living in refugee camps are the refugees. So we have refugees, exiles, expats. We have West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. We have Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians in what became Israel. Then we realized that the only way we can move ahead is if we have a collective voice, if we share in decision making. We wanted to rejuvenate, again, restructure and reform the PLO. Once again, to be the representative body for all Palestinians everywhere, to make room for people to take part in deciding their fate, their future, their leadership, and so on. So that, again, was something that was thwarted now, but it expressed itself, as we were talking about, in a spontaneous way, in a sense of coming together, of collectivity that is Palestinian, that recognizes its identity, its hopes, and that an identity whose components stand together. So that's the issue of elections, because Palestinian democracy is in trouble, in deep trouble.
It is.
The rule of law is in trouble as well.
And I hear that very clearly. We have a number of questions that surround sort of the next generation of leadership. I think a couple of things just for background for our listeners. I know it was very confusing for me when I was working on the negotiations in practice, but the simple theoretical difference between the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is the PLO represents all Palestinians, about 15 million everywhere. And the PA is in charge of those areas directly under Palestinian control. So if you think of the West Bank as a piece of Swiss cheese, the holes in the cheese are the Palestinian cities like Ramallah and Bethlehem. And so that's where the PA is. And that's the simple theoretical distinction. In practice, it gets much more complicated.
But the PA was established by the PLO.
Exactly.
Only temporarily for the interim phase that was supposed to end in 1999 to deliver services and build institutions in preparation for independence.
Right.
And yet the interim phase became permanent, and Israel used it to exercise more control and to turn the PA into a sort of instrument for administration under occupation, which made it lose a lot of credibility among the people, especially with the failure of the negotiating process. Anyway, go ahead.
Where my question gets to, because I see several people in the chat, from Teresa Casal to Ilan Bass in Italy, asking questions about sort of this next generation of leadership. And the points that you just made about PLO reform, the election, these are discussions that have been going on for many years. Like the PLO's legislative body, sorry, there's a big truck outside. The PLO's legislative body, the Palestinian National Council, had the majority of its members are dead because there haven't been elections in so long. And so PLO reform has been on the agenda for so long. And I'm not interested in the question of like PLO PA reform as much as, okay, you're a young person, you grew up, you're 25 years old. You've seen, the Oslo process be a complete and total disaster and failure. You've seen one set of elections for the PA in your life, and the same people in power, which is why you resigned and have been working your whole career to build up other leadership, which is so admirable. But if you're that young person, okay, we have a President Abbas, but who's leading? Who's this next generation? Because the current structures aren't adequately organizing Palestinian Palestinian aspirations and providing outlets for that. And so I think this has to contribute to some of what we're seeing on the ground today, but it also is a potential huge opportunity for Palestinians to really put forward the Palestinian issue on a new light in the world stage, and also to Israelis potentially. So who are these young leaders, and what should we look for, and who can we support?
Yeah, well, there were 1 million people who registered for elections who had never elected before in their life. And that was amazing. These young people and they're looking for their own voice, for their own representation. And as I said, many of them joined or formed their own electoral lists or their own parliamentary blocks, if you will, to run. Many of them on the basis of reform, many of them different agendas and so on, but most of them in defiance of the status quo of the existing leadership. Now, if you look around Palestine and outside, you will see that there is enormous potential. There is tremendous energy. There is real power. There is real intelligence. I mean, the Palestinians all over the world, not just under occupation, have so much to give. And they have fought all their lives, because whatever they made of themselves, they did by their own energy, by their own initiative. They were never lifted up. They lifted themselves up by their bootstraps. They know the world. They can connect. They are highly educated, and they are so committed. It's really invigorating when I hear them speak, when I'm in touch with them. And as you know, I have many, many interns and many people I had mentored, young women, young men who I thought would be within this new system. And I promised them, I'm not going to run, we're not going to run. My generation and even the generation after me and the 2 generations before me should not hog power. They should just make room for the younger generation. And I promised them I would campaign for them, I would help them. And when they announced this, we were so happy that we started meetings. I started, discussions and I don't want to say training, but exchanging experiences with the younger women and young men to see how to run campaigns, how to be public speakers, how to appeal to your constituencies, how to prepare your own elections material, for example, from practical things to really very high theoretical issues. And they were just so thirsty, so excited that they're entering this by their own will. And I got lots of messages from Palestinians outside, mainly in the States. You really have a very active Palestinian American community that wants to be part of the system. Yes. And they want to be part of the reform, and they want to reform the PLO, and they know the importance of the PLO as a representative for all Palestinians everywhere. So they wanted to be in the elections. And we said, that's why there were elections for the PNC. I mean, the PLC, which is temporary, and anyway, I was against that, but still it was declared. The PNC is the Palestine National Council, which is the parliament, the national parliament for all Palestinians. So we were looking at ways in which the younger generations and these people of real commitment and vision and energy and so on can join and can be elected and can represent their own generations and their own sense of vision and can connect us with the world as well. And unfortunately, now with the postponing of the PLC, you also have postponement of the subsequent 2 elections, the presidential and the PNC. But I still think that maybe in different places, this is an idea I have, I don't know, in different places, maybe they can still hold their own elections, whether it is elections for student councils, whether it's elections for women's groups, Palestinian Americans, Palestinian Canadians, Palestinian Europeans, Palestinian Lebanese, wherever they are. And they can maybe have elections in their own organizations, because they are also very active in their own grassroots movements and in their own civil society organizations. This way you come up with the names, you give them visibility, you give them a platform, you empower them, you elevate them, and then they can be seen and they can have an inning into the collective political system. This is one suggestion, but there are many other ways. the younger generation, the new leadership is there. You just need to be able to make room for them and not to block them,
Right.
and not to thwart their efforts. And I see them in the streets. I see them going to sit and have iftar in front of the settlers, and I see the settlers attacking them. I see the Israeli army and border guards and so on attack them and beat them up and so on, the way we were attacked and beaten up. So now it's their turn. But this is how they have to show that to themselves and to each other that we are here and we are doing something about this, and we will make our own space, and we have our own vision and our own discourse. And as you said, many of them are moving towards a rights discourse. And I still believe it's not just human rights, it's the right to self-determination, it's a totality of rights that have to be addressed for Palestinians. And if we can get rid of the occupation, it seems to me, that would be the beginning of freedom. We really need freedom. We need to live in freedom and dignity on our own land. This is very important. And the Palestinian resilience to stay is absolutely crucial, because Israel wants to get rid of us. Israel wants to render the myth of the people with the land without a people for a people without a land into a reality by getting rid of the people of the land. And we're not going to allow it to do that. And if we can in any way get Palestinians back to Palestine, that would be really a very significant change, even though Israel controls everything, including the entry and exit and ID cards and whatever.
I want to encourage our listeners, we do have weekly webinar series, and we will also be having conversations in the coming weeks, including on May 25th, with some local grassroots leaders to get a very different perspective on here. You're facing this impossible situation. How do you affect change? And, particularly for Palestinian grassroots leaders, where there isn't an effective government there either. But I want to bring it back, in the last minutes of our call, to this idea of what people can do. And there's a question from Becca Pugh, which I think, gets asked increasingly, which may be an interesting thing. But the question is, why are progressives so willing to speak up about every other issue of social justice, but when it comes to Palestinians, silence or dismissal? For those of us who've grown up in this issue, we have an actual acronym for this: PEP, Progressive Accept Palestine.
PAP, yeah. Progressive accept on Palestine. That's true. And I've heard of this and I've seen it personally, and we've worked with many people. There is a certain degree of timidity, because there has been a concerted effort. For a long time, our narrative was suppressed, and then it was taken over by our enemy. Israel is the one who presented us to the world in a very negative, distorted, stereotyped way. We were either the pitiful refugees or we were the terrorists all the time. I mean, it's incredible how this term somehow becomes current in people's minds if you keep repeating it all the time, and what we see is state terrorism by Israel, not terrorism by Palestine. But anyway, so the issue is I'm sorry, what was
the PEP? Like, why is it that
the PEPs, exactly. There is a certain degree of intimidation. Israel is trying to render any criticism of Israel and conflate it with anti-Semitism, as you know. And that intimidates many people. Many are adopting in the States, even though they're losing that, but many are adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates it with criticism of Israel, as though Israel stands for everything Jewish, which is not right. Because many of our Jewish allies in the States and in Europe don't want to be associated with Israel and with what Israel does. They are extremely critical. And they don't like the IHRA definition, which in many ways suppresses and censors, suppresses freedom of speech and prevents people from expressing solidarity and support. Solidarity with Palestine and support for the Palestinian cause, or any criticism of Israel. And it has been used effectively. The anti-Semitic smear is there, ready to use, like a post-it. You pull it out and you put it on somebody's forehead, should they say we criticize Israel and what it does to the Palestinians. In the same way as if Palestinians should do anything in any way remotely violent, then the post-it of terrorism comes out. This is one. Two, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, for example, has been criminalized to the detriment of freedom of speech and the right to choose, the right to be ethical consumers, and the right to be ethical investors. People don't want to be complicit in the occupation, but you're preventing them from doing that. And in the US, some states adopted legislations, passed bills that say, if you boycott Israel, then you will be boycotted, because Israel must not be boycotted in any way, shape, or form. But you give yourself the right to boycott American firms and American people. This is illogical. It's insane. So that has created a certain atmosphere. Now it's becoming more and more clear, but now you have a movement that is defying this. You have people like Betty McCollum, you have others in Congress who are speaking out, and even though they're attacked by AIPAC. Now, AIPAC for a long time was the drafter par excellence of almost all the bills and legislation having to do with Palestine, Israel. And in many cases, they would take the draft as is and present it, and it gets passed. And this had to do a lot with elections, not just with votes, but with funds, with campaign funding more than anything else. And unfortunately, without campaign funding reform in the US, you're going to continue with people, in a sense, using their own money in order to influence who gets into Congress, who represents the American people and who doesn't. There was a real timidity, and there are historical precedents where people who spoke out for Palestine lost their jobs, lost elections. They were reorganized, I don't know what you call it, in Congress and so on. So we need to get rid of this fear. We need to have a space of freedom of expression. We need the facts to come out. We need people to know what's happening. That's why advocacy is very important, because once you know what's happening, you cannot be silenced and you cannot be intimidated. And we need to know that you won't lose if you support Palestinians. I remember years ago, I was talking to two members, and both of them were chairs of their parties, and I had them together. And many told me, what's in it for us? What's in it for me? If I support Israel, I have everything to gain, nothing to lose. If I support Palestine, I have everything to lose, nothing to gain. Now that's no longer true. That's no longer an absolute fact the way it used to be. Look at Jamal Bowman and how he defeated Engels in an election that was strongly funded even by the Republicans, even by AIPAC and so on, and he's a Democrat, because he was pro-Israel, so blindly pro-Israel. And so you had somebody who didn't have the money, who didn't have all the trimmings so far and so on, and all those years and years of privilege, and he won. There are changes now. There are people of conscience who are appealing to their own constituency on the basis of values, of morality, of responsibility, of respecting the human rights of people, of humanizing others, and of doing the right thing. A very simple situation. You have to do the right thing. And knowledge in this case is not just power, is a responsibility. Once you know, you cannot allow, you have to unlearn what you have learned, but once you know, you have to proceed. And you have to change a very, very unjust and painful situation for which you have been unwittingly complicit. Because people were taking decisions on your behalf, your representatives, that victimized the Palestinians even further, and that enabled Israeli violations even further. So now this has to be addressed and redressed, and I think it's happening. It's going to take a lot more of work and mobilization and solidarity, and this network that is emerging to us. It's extremely encouraging and tells us that there is hope. The younger generations are beginning to know more. They are, like all younger generations, they are more daring. They will take more risks. They are willing to speak truth to power. This is what we need.
Right. And I think it's such a challenge because there'll have to be some buildup of institutional power as well. And that's what it seems there's, we're lacking a path for that. But one of the things that we talk about at Telos is just we talk about peacemaking a lot, which, by the way, is a concept that's in general culture, but it's also in the Bible. And we talk about it specifically as collaboration across lines of difference for the common good, not just to sit around and sing kumbaya, but to address justice head on, and these systems in which some people lose at the expense of others, but to work towards mutual flourishing. So, as I'm listening to you, there are a number of points that some of our folks may have missed. I know, and I don't mean this to be offensive, but I know many of people on the call may disagree with some of your analysis and your points. But the bottom line here is that for decades now, Palestinian perspectives and Palestinian bodies and Palestinian livelihoods and agency have consistently been marginalized. If we agree that Palestinians are equal human beings, then we have to actually take action and speak up on behalf of Palestinian lives, just as we do and would on behalf of Israeli lives and any other lives. But there's an urgent situation here. So for us as Americans, I hear that well. And one of the points that you made earlier about the legislation here, BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, is quite controversial within the states. But and I know many folks on the call have different perspectives on BDS, but many people may not be aware that in over 24 states, there is actual legislation that has passed that restricts free speech, that defines Israel as not just Israel, but including the settlements. And if you want to get a job and as a public school teacher, or you need hurricane relief after a disaster, you have to sign a declaration that you won't boycott Israel or its settlements. And people have been denied. And I know there's a lot of materials coming out around this. So this isn't something that's half a world away. This is something that's in our communities too. As I mentioned, many people on this call.
There are many who lost on appeal, by the way.
Yeah.
There are many courts of appeal that refuse to hold up the ruling or to accept that BDS is something that can be criminalized because it infringes on your right to freedom, on your freedom of speech, on your right to choose, as we said, on your right to be ethical consumers and ethical investors. This is very important because when you put Israel's right as part of your state legislation, there is something seriously wrong with your loyalties and with your priorities. That's another thing, though. Anyway.
Well, I wanted to mention one logistical thing and then draw in one last question for your final word here. But to encourage people that regardless of what your politics are on this call, if we can agree on our common humanity and the need to urgently rectify this situation as a justice issue, not just sort of like an abstract conflict, then allowing voices like Dr. Ashrawi's to be heard, or some of the young people that we'll hear in a week, who you can hear if you sign up for our newsletter or our events email. David Kadaba will drop a link in the chat for that. That these voices are important too. And it's not necessarily about agreement, but getting to that place where everybody enjoys freedom, dignity, and security requires diverse, complex coalitions of people who recognize that fundamental human rights need to be at the center of our discourse. They don't need to be everything, but they really need to be at the center of our discourse.
Absolutely. Yes, correct.
On that,
but there can be no peace without justice. Any peace that is not built on justice is not peace. And as you know that you quoted the Bible. Anyway, a just peace is the only peace that has legitimacy and that can last. A peace based on coercion and oppression is not peace. It is temporary subjugation and it will erupt again. But we have to be responsible. And I think in the States you are having people who are working not just at the grassroots level, but within different organizations in order to set up, as you said, these organizations and structures and institutions that will last and that will build incrementally. And I think it's very important.
They are. And so question, at first affirmation, just if you have seen our principles and practices of peacemaking, David will drop those in the chat, but our third principle of peacemaking is justice. Peace and justice are intertwined. As Dr. King said, peace is not the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And that's fundamental for us to understand as potential peacemakers. But I'd love to give you the final word. We have a diverse group of this on this call: conservative, liberal, some Palestinian, some Jewish, lots of Americans. rather Palestinians, Israelis, Americans of all different stripes. What would you like us to, if you have one ask for us to do, what would you like us to do when we say goodbye to you and go off?
That I wish I could have just one thing to ask you and it'll be miraculously all right. I think the important thing is to recognize not just the humanity and the equality of Palestinians, but to act, to challenge the power systems, to challenge the distortions, to challenge the lies, actually. Peace is not a concession. Peace is a right. We have the right to live in peace and dignity and so on our own land. And so in order to achieve peace, you have to recognize that the Palestinians deserve all these rights. And it seems very counterintuitive to just say, affirm our humanity. But it is important because for so long, the whole system was built on the fact that the Palestinians do not deserve this recognition, do not deserve a platform, do not deserve to be heard, do not deserve all the rights that other people take for granted. But now when you challenge this prevailing discourse, which is not really any discourse, it's distortions, and when you stand up and speak out for what is right, and then I think you're doing a great deal in order to change the course of history in order to make peace possible. We talked about peace with justice, it's important. To us in Palestine, look, we need you to recognize that I represent among the oldest Christian tradition in the world. And I don't want you to do us any favor, but I want you to recognize that we have always been a pluralistic, tolerant, inclusive society. And that's how we want to be. And Jerusalem defies exclusive possession. Jerusalem is a city that is sacred to everybody, but by law it is an occupied city, and it's subjected to the worst type of regime you can think of. And people in the States may feel they're far away, but at the same time, they're closer to Jerusalem and to Palestine than they think.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ashrawi. You gave us a lot to wrestle with and talk with. I want to thank all our callers for staying on for an hour and 15 minutes and to encourage you again that, the only way forward that's going to work for Palestinians will work for Palestinians and Israelis ultimately. We may not have a clear path towards a clear solution like the two-state solution anymore, but focusing on Palestinian and Israeli fundamental rights and building unusual coalitions across lines of difference that have our North Star as mutual flourishing, security, dignity, and freedom for both peoples, and that are able and willing to challenge sort of the extreme inequalities that we see of our days, how we get there. I invite all of you to join us in that effort. And Dr. Ashrawi, thank you once again for being so generous with your spirit and time and for decades of leadership that has shaped millions of lives, including my own. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, and thanks to everybody for bearing with me. I enjoyed being with you tonight.